Why do some people never change? Why do they repeat the same mistakes, return to the same wounds, and walk the same circles as if cursed? Carl Jung uncovered a forbidden truth. Stagnation is not laziness, nor fate. It is possession, a secret hidden in the unconscious, where the shadow binds a person to their own prison. What you are about to hear will not comfort. It will show you why some souls never escape them and why this secret should terrify. There are people who never move forward. They repeat the same arguments, live the same failures, cling to the same patterns year after year, as if chained to an invisible wheel. To the outside observer, it looks like stubbornness, laziness, or weakness. But Carl Jung revealed something darker. This repetition is not choice, but curse, a possession of the psyche that traps the individual in endless cycles. What does not evolve in consciousness reemerges in fate, and so their lives become circles rather than lines, closed loops instead of journeys. I recall a patient who embodied this curse. He came to me after a failed marriage, lamenting the betrayal and distance of his wife. Years earlier, he had come for the same reason. After a different his stories changed names, but not the same arguments, the same accusations, the same collapse. He spoke of wanting change, but his eyes betrayed something else, an unconscious compulsion to repeat. Why does this always happen to me? The answer was brutal, because he never changed, and what is not transformed within returns again and again without. His life was not a story, it was a loop. Modern psychology names this repetition compulsion. Freud described it as the drive to reenact unresolved trauma, but Jung expanded it. Unresolved shadow elements control destiny itself. Studies show that people often recreate childhood dynamics in adult relationships, replaying wounds as though hoping for new outcomes. Neuroscience confirms that the brain, wired through repeated patterns, resists change fiercely. Neural pathways carved deep by habit are as stubborn as stone. Stagnation is not just weakness. It is biology and archetype conspiring to keep the self enslaved. Ancient wisdom whispered the same warning. In Greek myth, Sisyphus pushes his stone endlessly, each ascent collapsing back to. In the Bible, Israel wanders 40 years in circles, their disobedience binding them to the desert until a new generation. In Norse sagas, Ragnarok repeats the cycle of destruction and rebirth, an endless loop of violence and fire. Across cultures, stagnation is depicted not as stillness, but as repetition, an archetype of souls caught in eternal return. The signs of this possession are chilling. The friend who always falls in love with the same kind of destructive partner, the worker who changes jobs but always ends up with the same the addict who promises change but finds themselves back in the same darkness. These are not coincidences. They are symptoms of the soul trapped in repetition, enslaved by patterns it refuses to confront. The stages of stagnation unfold predictable cruelty. First, denial. The person insists nothing is wrong, that life will improve on its own. Second, repetition. The same mistakes and conflicts return, disguised with new names and faces. Third, despair. They begin to notice the cycle, but feel powerless to break it. Fourth, resignation. They accept their prison, claiming, "This is just who I am." Fifth, ossification. Their personality calcifies. Transformation becomes almost impossible, and the soul withers in stasis. When magnified to societies, this curse becomes cultural decay. Nations repeat the same wars. Empires rise and fall in identical arcs. Civilizations collapse from the very hubris that destroyed their ancestors. Jung warned that without conscious, humanity is doomed to repeat its tragedy, each generation blind to the lessons of the last. The secret of stagnation is not only personal, it is collective, written into history as a spiral of suffering. The protocol of survival demands confrontation with the shadow. Stagnation thrives on denial. Only awareness can break the loop. Jung taught that what we resist persists, but what we face transforms. To break repetition, one must recognize the hidden wound that commands it, drag it into consciousness, and integrate. Otherwise, the curse endures, and life dissolves into endless circles. But here is the merciless truth. Most people do not change because they do not want to pay the price of transformation. Change demands death, the death of ego, of comfort, of illusion. And so they prefer repetition, even suffering, because suffering feels safer than the unknown. Remember this: stagnation is not peace. It is a prison disguised as stability. And those who never change are not resting. They are trapped, endlessly circling the wheel of their own unconscious fate. There is a lie that stagnation tells, "I am safety." To those who live imprisoned by repetition, the cycle does not feel like a curse at first. It feels like stability. The routine, the familiar arguments, the well-known failures all become walls that enclose them. They believe these walls protect them from the chaos of the unknown. But Jung warned that what they call stability is often. The unconscious convinces them that it is better to remain in a prison they recognize than to risk freedom they cannot imagine. I once counseled a woman who remained in an abusive relationship for more than 20 years. She admitted she hated the man, feared him even, yet she confessed that leaving felt impossible. "At least I know what to expect here. What if outside it's worse?" Her words revealed the deeper secret. Her prison had become her identity. To leave it would be to step into the void. Stagnation masquerades as safety, but beneath it beats the heart of terror, the terror of transfer. Science explains why the psyche clings to this illusion. Neuroscientists describe the status quo bias. The brain resists change because uncertainty triggers the amygdala, the center of fear. Studies at Columbia University reveal that even when offered better alternatives, people often choose the familiar simply because it is predictable. Evolution once favored caution. To repeat old patterns, even painful, was safer than venturing into the unknown jungle. But in modern life, this instinct becomes a curse, chaining souls to cycles of misery. Ancient myths depicted this illusion as deadly comfort. In the Bible, Lot's wife looks back at her burning city, unable to release the familiarity of destruction, and she turns into salt, frozen forever. In Greek tragedy, Penelope's endless weaving becomes not only loyalty, but paralysis, her life defined by waiting. In Norse legend, those who refuse to leave the old world before Ragnarok are consumed in flames, punished for clinging to ruins. These stories echo the same truth. What feels safe can be the true danger. The signs of this illusion are subtle. The worker who complains daily about their job but never applies elsewhere. The lover who laments betrayal but always returns to the same arms. The addict who despises the substance but cannot release the ritual. Each one confuses familiarity with safety, unable to see that their stillness is rotting them from within. The stages of this illusion unfold like a slow hypnosis. First, rationalization. It's not so bad. Things could be worse. Second, justification. At least I know how to handle this. Third, attachment. The prison becomes a part of identity. Fourth, fear. The very thought of change feels like death. Fifth, paralysis. Transformation is no longer imaginable, and the cycle becomes eternal. Jung would call this the tyranny of the complex, an unconscious pattern that convinces the ego it is free while secretly enslaving it. When expanded to collectives, the illusion of stability poisons entire societies. Nations cling to outdated systems, fearing collapse more than corruption. Religions hold on to dogmas long after their spirit has died, worshiping forms instead of truth. Families repeat toxic dynamics for generations, excusing them as tradition. The familiar becomes sacred even when it destroys. History is filled with empires that mistook stagnation for stability, only to crumble when the world changed around them. The protocol of survival is confrontation with fear. One must admit that stability is often disguised, that the comfort of repetition hides decay. Jung taught that transformation begins where certainty ends, and that the path of individuation is always through the unknown. To step out of stagnation is to die to who you were, but also to be reborn. Yet most will not do this. Most will cling to their prisons, convincing themselves They will rot with the illusion of stability, mistaking the chains around their wrists for bracelets of gold. Remember this: safety is not the absence. True safety is growth. And when life stands still too long, what you are calling stability may already be your grave. Every stagnant soul is haunted by a secret terror, the fear of becoming someone new. Change is not simply uncomfortable, it is experienced as death. Jung warned that transformation always requires sacrifice: the death of the old self, the burial of outdated illusions, the shattering of identities that once provided safety. For those who resist change, this process feels unbearable. They cling to their suffering because at least their suffering is familiar. To step into transformation feels like stepping into the abyss. I once treated a man who remained in the same profession for 30 years. Though he confessed he hated every day of it, he fantasized about escape, about creating art, about starting a new life. But every time he approached the threshold of change, his body betrayed him. He shook with panic, broke into sweat, retreated into excuses. "I don't know who I'd be if I left," he admitted. That was the truth of his prison. He feared the unknown more than the pain of stagnation. For him, change was not opportunity, it was annihilation. Science confirms this fear in startling ways. Neuroscientists describe how the brain treats uncertainty as threat. The amygdala floods the body with cortisol at the prospect of change, triggering fight or flight. Psychologists identify loss aversion, the tendency to fear losing the familiar more than gaining the new. Studies show that even when transformation promises better outcomes, people cling to their misery because misery feels safer than mystery. Ancient myths illustrated this fear vividly. In the Exodus story, freed slaves begged to return to Egypt, preferring chains to the wilderness of transformation. In Greek myth, Orpheus looks back at Eurydice in terror of losing what was, and his fear destroys his chance for renewal. In Norse legend, even the gods fear the coming of Ragnarok, resisting the rebirth that follows. These stories remind us that fear of change is universal, an archetype etched into the human condition. The signs of this are everywhere. The artist who never finishes their work, terrified of what comes after. The lover who clings to toxic relationships rather than face solitude. The worker who sabotages opportunities because success would demand a new identity. They dress their fear in excuses. It's not the right time. I can't risk it. Things might get worse. But beneath the excuses is the same terror. Transformation feels like death. The stages of this fear unfold with grim regularity. First, desire. The dream of change flickers. Second, hesitation. Fear whispers that it is dangerous. Third, retreat. The dream is abandoned, replaced by excuses. Fourth, repetition. The cycle continues, identical to the past. Fifth, despair. The realization that nothing, the terror of this cycle repeats endlessly, the soul circling its prison, the shadow feeding on fear. When amplified across society, the fear of transformation paralyzes entire culture. Nations cling to old systems, fearing collapse if they evolve. Religions fossilize into dogma, worshiping the past instead of embracing new revelation. Families chain children to outdated traditions, mistaking control for safety. History shows again and again that civilizations fall not because of change, but because of their refusal to change. The protocol of survival is brutal honesty. Transformation is death. Something in you must die for something else to be born. Jung called this process individuation, the confrontation with shadow, the integration of the rejected self, the embrace of wholeness. It is terrifying because it demands surrender of identity. But without it, stagnation becomes destiny. Yet most will not face it. Most will choose their cages, polishing their chains, convincing themselves they are safe. They will dream of change but never take the step, haunted by the abyss of transformation until their lives expire. Remember this: fear of transformation is fear of life itself. For life is change, and to resist it, the stagnant soul may believe it survives by refusing to change, but in truth, it dies a little each day, until the final death arrives, indistinguishable from the life it refused. Every person is a shadow, the hidden, rejected of the self that remain buried in the unconscious. For those who never change, the shadow becomes not just a companion, but a jailer. Jung warned that what is denied inwardly returns outwardly as fate. In stagnation, this law is merciless. The shadow binds the individual to repetition, to paralysis, to the endless recycling of wounds. What they cannot face within, they relive without, until their entire life becomes the prison walls erected by their own unconscious. I once met a woman who had lived her whole life accusing others of betrayal. Every friendship ended the same way. Every romance into suspicion. She believed she was cursed by disloyalty in others, blind to the truth that her own shadow was the architect. Her repressed jealousy, her unacknowledged fear of abandonment, created the very pattern she despised. Her stagnation was not accident, it was possession. The shadow had taken her hand and was writing her destiny. Science now confirms this timeless insight. Psychologists describe confirmation bias, the tendency to notice only what reinforces one's existing fears and beliefs. Neuroscience shows that trauma alters brain pathways, training the mind to repeat patterns of danger even when none exists. The shadow is not mystical, it is psychological reality. What is unprocessed controls us. Stagnation is simply the outward form of an inner refusal. Ancient wisdom understood the curse of shadow. In Greek myth, Oedipus flees his fate only to fulfill it because he cannot see his own unconscious drive. In the Bible, King Saul repeats his paranoia until it destroys him, unable to face his own insecurity. In Norse legend, Loki, cast out and denied, returns again and again to sabotage the gods, his rejection becoming their endless downfall. Across myth, the rejected self becomes destiny, the shadow ruling from the dark. The signs of shadow possession are unmistakable. The man who always blames others for his failures, blind to his own patterns. The parent who criticizes children for flaws they secretly hate in themselves. The leader who persecutes enemies to distract from his own corruption. Each repetition is the shadow pulling the strings. Each stagnation, another cycle of unconscious. The stages of this possession are brutal. First, denial. The trait is buried, unseen. Second, projection. The trait is noticed in others, hated, attacked. Third, repetition. The same conflict returns again and again. Fourth, domination. The shadow gains power. The ego becomes its mask. Fifth, imprisonment. The individual cannot escape the cycle, living a life written not by choice, but by shadow. Jung wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. In stagnation, this truth is carved in stone. When magnified to collectives, the shadow's chains bind entire societies. Nations that refuse to face their violence accuse others of aggression, repeating wars endlessly. Religions that deny their lusts demonize sexuality, enslaving generations in guilt. Cultures that bury their greed accuse outsiders of exploitation while consuming themselves from within. Jung warned that unacknowledged shadows lead to psychic epidemics, where entire civilizations stagnate, repeating the same tragedies because they refuse to see their own reflection. The protocol of survival is confrontation. The only way to break stagnation is to turn inward, to face the shadow with unflinching honesty, to name the envy, the rage, the fear, the desire, not to excuse it, not to project it, but to integrate it. Jung called this individuation, the marriage of light and dark within. Without this confrontation, the shadow rules inside, dragging the soul through endless circles. Yet most will not do. They fear the mirror more than the prison. They prefer to blame others, to live as victims of fate, to surrender to cycles rather than confront the abyss. And so their shadow rules them until the end, their lives monuments to repetition. Remember this, the shadow is not it is your unfinished self. But if you refuse to face it, it will bind you forever, turning your life into a wheel that never moves forward. And when you die, you will not leave behind a story. You will leave behind a circle, endlessly repeating itself in those who come after you. A prison can be unbearable, yet many decorate their cells, convincing themselves they are home. This is the paradox of stagnation. People cling to their cages because the bars feel safer than the open road. Jung wrote that the psyche often prefers bondage to freedom because freedom requires responsibility. In the cage, the stagnant soul can blame fate, others, or circumstance. Outside, in the unknown, they would have no excuse, and so they polish their chains until they shine like jewels, mistaking slavery for stability. I once spoke with a man who hated his job with venom. Every day he complained of its meaninglessness, of his tyrant boss, of the emptiness it carved into his soul. Yet when opportunities arose to change, he found reasons to stay. At least here, I know the rules. What if I fail somewhere else? His misery had become his sanctuary. He had made peace with despair because despair was familiar. His cage was not forced upon him. It was chosen. Modern psychology calls this learned helpless. Experiments by Martin Seligman showed that animals, once trapped and shocked without escape, eventually stopped trying to flee. Even when freedom was possible, their minds had adapted to suffering, accepting the cage as destined. Humans do the same. Trauma, repetition, and fear condition them to surrender. They convince themselves that change is dangerous, that stagnation is inevitable. The shadow whispers that escape is impossible, and they believe it. Ancient stories capture this same haunting truth. In the Bible, the Israelites, freed from slavery, begged to return to Egypt rather than face the wilderness of uncertainty. In Greek myth, Persephone, though queen of the underworld, eats the pomegranate seeds that bind her to Hades, ensuring her return to darkness each year. In Norse tales, captives who could flee often remained in servitude, fearing the cold wilderness more than the whip. Across traditions, the cage is always more seductive than the unknown. The signs of this comfort are everywhere. The spouse who stays in a loveless marriage because, at least, I'm not alone. The worker who stays decades in misery because it pays the bills. The addict who clings to poison because without it, I wouldn't know who I am. These are not excuses. They are the rituals of stagnation, the prayers of those who worship the comfort of the cage. The stages of this possession are merciless. First, resistance. The soul protests its prison, crying out in frustration. Second, adaptation. The bars become familiar. Despair softens into routine. Third, justification. The prisoner claims the cage is protection. Fourth, identification. They no longer see themselves outside the cage. Fifth, permanence. The soul surrenders entirely, unable to imagine freedom, convinced the cage is life itself. When entire societies embrace the comfort of the cage, cultures collapse into inertia. Nations accept corrupt leaders because change would be worse. Religions cling to rituals devoid of spirit because at least it is tradition. Families repeat cycles of abuse because that's how it has always been. Jung warned that societies addicted to safety are already dead because life itself is transformation. Stagnation, when collective, is cultural suicide. The protocol of survival is brutal honesty, to recognize when you have mistaken your cage for home, to admit that what feels safe is killing you slowly. Jung believed that individuation begins with breaking illusions, tearing down the comforting lies disguised prisons as protection. The path forward is terrifying because it requires stepping naked into uncertainty. But only there does life begin. And yet, most will not dare. They will stay in their cages until death, proud of their stability, blind to the bars. They will die without ever having lived, their souls embalmed in the comfort of repetition. Remember this, the cage is never safety. It is decay disguised as shelter. And if you choose it long enough, you'll discover too late the comfort you clung to was your coffin all along. There is a moment when stagnation ceases to be unconscious and becomes addiction. At first, people resist their complain of their prison, dream of change, but eventually something shifts. They begin to crave the very repetition that enslaves them. Jung warned that the psyche grows attached to its complexes, feeding on familiar wounds like an addict feeds on poison. Pain becomes identity. Failure becomes ritual. The same story is told again and again, not because it is desired, but because the soul no longer knows how to live without it. I once knew a woman who cycled through relationships with abusive men. Each time she swore it would be different. Each time she ended in tears. But what chilled me was not her despair. It was her secret excitement at the beginning of each new cycle. This one feels familiar. Of course, her unconscious craved the pattern as if repetition itself were love. She was not merely trapped, she was addicted. Science explains this horrifying. Neuroscientists show that familiar experiences, even painful ones, release dopamine simply because they are predictable. The brain rewards repetition, mistaking it for safety. Psychologists describe the trauma bond, where victims of abuse become chemically attached to their abusers through cycles of pain and reward. The compulsion to repeat is not just habit, it is chemical dependency. Stagnation is a drug the psyche injects into it, numbing the terror of the unknown with the comfort of the familiar. The ancients told these same stories in myth. In Greek tragedy, Medea's rage repeats her mother's wounds, binding her to the same cycle of destruction. In the Bible, Samson repeats his folly with Delilah, craving the pattern that will ruin him. In Norse sagas, warriors sworn to vengeance feed endlessly on blood feuds, unable to stop, addicted to the ritual of violence. In every tradition, repetition is depicted as hunger. An appetite devours the soul. The signs of addiction to repetition are chillingly recognizable. The gambler who swears each loss is the last, yet cannot resist. The partner who returns again and again to betrayal, as though betrayal were proof of love. The worker who sabotages every promotion, unable to imagine life beyond struggle. These are not mistakes. They are rituals of addiction. Each repetition is dark, feeding the unconscious. The stages of this addiction unfold descent. First, resistance. Pain is felt but endured. Second, surrender. The pattern repeats. Excuses form. Third, craving. The cycle is anticipated, even longed for. Fourth, dependence. The person cannot function without the ritual. Fifth, annihilation. The soul loses all identity beyond its repetitions. Jung described this as identification with the complex, the ego dissolved into the addiction of the shadow. When magnified to societies, addiction to repetition becomes collective self-destruction. Nations addicted to war cannot rest in peace, inventing enemies to feed the cycle. Economies addicted to exploitation repeat collapses across centuries, unable to learn. Families addicted to trauma repeat abuse for generations, calling it destiny. The addiction is not personal, it is archetypal, a poison flowing through humanity itself. The protocol of survival is ruthless awareness. One must recognize repetition not as accident, but as compulsion. Jung believed that to break the cycle, the unconscious must be dragged into the light, the complex named, the addiction confessed. This is why confession, ritual, and therapy can shatter patterns. They transform the addictive ritual into conscious choice. Without this confrontation, the soul feeds endlessly on itself. But the grim truth remains. Most do not want freedom. They crave the poison because the poison feels like home. They cling to their repetition like a lover, blind to the coffin is building around them. Remember this, repetition is not stability, it is hunger. And if you feed it long enough, it will consume everything until nothing remains of you but the echo of the same mistake repeated forever. Stagnation is not only an individual curse. When it spreads through groups, families, or entire nations, it becomes collective death. Jung warned that psychic epidemics are far more destructive than physical ones because they infect not the body, but the soul of civilizations. A single stagnant man ruins his own life. A stagnant culture destroys generations. The archetype of immobility, once multiplied, binds entire societies to cycles of decay, repeating the same mistakes century after century, convinced they are progressing, while in truth, they rot in place. I once lectured in a city that seemed alive with technology and wealth, yet beneath the glittering surface was decay. Families disconnected, traditions hollowed, young people lost in apathy. Their leaders spoke of growth, but the words were empty, recycled slogans from decades past. The society was stagnant, disguising its paralysis with noise and light. They were not moving forward, they were circling, repeating. And in the silence between speeches, I could feel the weight. Science now studies this as cultural inertia. Sociologists describe how institutions resist transformation even when failure is obvious. Systems calcify, protecting themselves at the expense of progress. Neuroscience suggests that collective habits mirror individual ones. Groups, like brains, wire themselves into patterns, repeating rituals and ideologies because the alternative, reinvention, feels too dangerous. Nations addicted to their myths choose decay over rebirth. Ancient myths warned of this. In the Bible, entire kingdoms fall because they repeat idolatry and injustice, blind to warnings. In Greek tragedy, dynasties collapse under generational curses, each new king repeating the sins of his father. In Norse sagas, Ragnarok is not just the end of the gods, it is their refusal to change, their certainty that they can fight fate, even as it devours them. In every tradition, collective stagnation is depicted as doom, written not by enemies, but by the refusal to evolve. The signs of collective stagnation are unmistakable. Nations clinging to traditions that no longer serve. Families repeating patterns of abuse while calling them heritage. Religions obsessed with rituals long after their meaning is gone. Cultures worshiping nostalgia, fearing the unknown more than death. These are not acts of preservation. They are symptoms of a society trapped in its own shadow, mistaking repetition for identity. The stages of collective stagnation mirror those of the individual. First, denial. Leaders and citizens insist that nothing is wrong. Second, ritualization. Patterns are repeated mechanically even when hollow. Third, justification. Decay is excused as stability, corruption as necessity. Fourth, paralysis. The culture can no longer innovate or adapt. Fifth, collapse. The society crumbles, overtaken by those willing to evolve. History records these collapses again and again, yet humanity refuses to learn. Examples haunt our memory. The fall of Rome, addicted to its own decadence, unable to transform. The collapse of monarchies that clung to power, blind to revolution. Modern democracies rotting from within, repeating divisions, unable to renew themselves. Jung's warning resounds. Civilizations fall not from external threats, but from the stagnation of their own unconscious. The protocol of survival is conscious. Collectives must confront their shadows as individuals do. They must name their addictions, their repetitions, their illusions of stability. They must dare to reinvent, to allow old forms to die so that new life can emerge. Jung believed individuation was not only personal but cultural, the integration of shadow on a scale that could heal nations. But such courage is rare. For the grim truth is this: most societies prefer the comfort of the cave. They worship their myths, polish their ruins, repeat their tragedy. They call it tradition, destiny, patriotism. And so they circle the wheel until collapse arrives, mistaking the grave for stability. Remember this: collective stagnation is a curse more terrifying than individual failure. A stagnant man loses his soul. A stagnant society loses its future. And unless the shadow is faced, the curse condemning not only one life but millions to the endless cycle of decay. Stagnation is not merely refusal to change, it is war against time itself. Time demands transformation. Seasons turn, bodies age, relationships evolve, civilizations rise and fall. To resist change is to resist time, and this resistance breeds madness. Jung warned that those who cling to permanence fight not only the unconscious, but the very current of existence. They become ghosts before death, clinging to the illusion that they can stop the river, but the river never stops. It drags them under, drowning their souls in repetition. I once counseled an aging man who refused to accept that his youth had passed. He dressed as he had decades earlier, chased the same pleasures, spoke of the same dreams. To him, nothing had changed, but his face betrayed the lie. His body carried the weight of years, the sorrow. He confessed that he could not look in the mirror without rage. I feel as if time has betrayed me. In truth, he had betrayed time. His stagnation was rebellion against the inevitable, and that rebellion was killing him. Science confirms this futile war. Psychologists describe the phenomenon of temporal dissonance, when people refuse to update their self-image, clinging to outdated identities. Neuroscience shows that when the brain resists new information about aging or change, stress hormones surge, damaging body and mind. Social scientists warn that refusal to adapt to time's demands leads to depression, bitterness, and alienation. Stagnation is not only psychological, it is temporal suicide. The ancients told the same story. In Greek myth, Tithonus is granted immortality, but not eternal youth, cursed to wither forever because he clung to life without change. In the Bible, Lot's wife turns to salt when she looks back, refusing to let time move forward. In Norse legend, the gods cling to their old world, fighting Ragnarok even as it consumes them. In every myth, those who resist time meet destruction, not salvation. The signs of this war appear everywhere. The parent who cannot accept that their children have grown, treating them forever as fragile. The worker who clings to outdated skills, refusing to evolve until they are cast aside. The partner who mourns endlessly for what love once was, unable to embrace what love has become. These are not simply nostalgic souls. They are soldiers fighting a war they cannot win. The stages of this battle unfold, relentless. First, denial. Time's changes are ignored. Second, resentment. The soul grows bitter against its own aging, its own evolution. Third, fixation. The person clings to rituals, fashions, or identities of the past. Fourth, collapse. The present becomes unbearable, and the soul sinks into despair. Fifth, annihilation. Time wins as it always does, leaving only ruins where there was one. When magnified to societies, this war becomes cultural paralysis. Nations refuse to let go of their myths, clinging to ancient glories while crumbling in the present. Religions insist on forms long emptied of spirit, fearing the flow of history. Entire civilizations rot because they refuse to surrender to time's demand, change or die. History is filled with empires that fell not from external enemies, but from the war they waged against the clock. The protocol of survival is surrender, not to weakness, but to time itself, to acknowledge that change is the only permanence. Jung believed individuation demanded this surrender, the recognition that each stage of life requires new identities, new integrations, new deaths, and new births. To refuse is to stagnate. To accept is to evolve. But most refuse. They cling to the past, fight time as if it were an enemy, and in doing so, they rot in place. They become monuments to themselves, tombstones erected while still breathing. Remember this, time is not your foe. It is your crucible. If you resist it, you stagnate and crumble. If you surrender to it, you transform. And only transformation can save you from the endless curse of eternal repetition. At the deepest level of stagnation, the soul no longer resists change. It forgets it was ever possible. This is the most terrifying stage, the collapse of the self. Jung wrote that the psyche, denied transformation for too long, loses its center, its capacity to imagine a future. The person ceases to be a story in motion and becomes a statue, carved by fear and habit, lifeless though still breathing. What remains is not a human life, but a fossilized mask, a self emptied of becoming. I once met a man who had lived in the same small apartment for nearly 40 years. At first it was simply a place of convenience. Later it became his entire world. He walked the same streets, ate the same meals, thought the same thoughts. When I asked him about dreams, he laughed bitterly. Dreams are for children. His eyes revealed the truth. His self he no longer imagined, no longer reached, no longer changed. He existed, but he did not live. Modern science recognizes this death in life. Psychologists describe existential stagnation, where meaning dissolves and identity ossifies. Neuroscientists observe that the brain, deprived of novelty and challenge, atrophies. Neuroplasticity diminishes, thought narrows, memory fades. Without change, the brain itself collapses, mirroring the soul. The person becomes less and less alive, even while their body continues. The ancients spoke of this horror too. In Greek myth, Niobe, punished for her pride, is turned into stone. her tears frozen forever. In the Bible, Saul, tormented by stagnation and fear, falls into madness and ends his life, consumed by his own paralysis. In Norse sagas, the realm of hell is not fire, but stillness, a place where souls wander endlessly in shadows, forgotten and unchanged. Across cultures, the collapse of the self is depicted as worse than death, a living petrification. The signs of this collapse can be seen in subtle but chilling ways. The person who stops learning, claiming they are too old. The worker who no longer asks questions, performing tasks without thought. The partner who repeats the same rituals of affection without passion. Love transformed into mechanical routine. Their souls have surrendered, not in a dramatic explosion, but in slow erosion. The stages of collapse are merciless. First, fatigue, the weariness. Second, cynicism, the rejection of dreams and hope. Third, numbness, the inability to feel joy or despair. Fourth, petrification, the self becomes rigid, incapable of adaptation. Fifth, dissolution, the soul forgets it ever had freedom. At this stage, the prison door could swing open and the prisoner would not leave, for they no longer remember what freedom is. When magnified to societies, the collapse of self becomes cultural death. Nations lose creativity, producing nothing but imitations of their past. Institutions become mechanical, repeating rituals devoid of spirit. Entire generations grow cynical, convinced nothing will ever change. History calls these dark ages, not because of external catastrophe, but because the collective soul petrifies. Jung warned that such collapses are inevitable when cultures deny their shadow and refuse transformation. The protocol of survival is reawakening. To confront the collapse, one must stir the soul with new encounters, new truths, new risks. Jung insisted that individuation required constant confrontation with the unknown, the willingness to step beyond what is comfortable, to die and be reborn. Without this, the self collapses into fossilization and life becomes a slow burial. But the tragedy remains. Most will not. They will drift into numbness, mistaking it for peace, convincing themselves that stagnation is maturity, that repetition is wisdom. They will live as statues until death comes. Remember this, the collapse of the self is not a sudden fall. It is a slow erosion. Each day, unchallenged repetition, refusal of transformation, chips away at the... And one day, without realizing it, you wake to find that you are no longer living. You are only existing. A shadow have been. At the end of all stagnation, there is no explosion, no drama, no revelation, only the endless wheel turning. The stagnant soul dies, circling the same patterns, blind to the freedom it never dared to see. Jung warned that the greatest danger to humanity was not catastrophe, but inertia. For catastrophe forces change, but inertia devours silently, erasing potential until nothing remains. Those who never change do not perish. They are buried in repetition. I remember a patient who, at the end of his life, confessed with trembling hands, "I thought things would eventually change on their own." He had lived decades waiting for transformation to come from outside, from chance, from others. But nothing changed because he never changed. His eyes filled with terror as he realized the truth too late. His life had been a wheel, turning endless, bringing him always back to the same point. His last words haunted me. "I never left the..." Science gives this wheel its own language. Psychologists describe behavioral loops, unconscious circuits that repeat until interrupted by conscious will. Neuroscience confirms that the brain conserves energy, defaulting to habit, resisting the effort of transformation. Sociology observes that families, institutions, and nations repeat patterns for generations, unable to escape without radical confrontation. The wheel is not metaphor, it is biological, psychological, cultural. Without awareness, every human life risks becoming a closed circuit. Ancient myths painted this wheel as fate. In Greek legend, Ixion is bound to a fiery wheel, eternally spinning for his crimes. In Hindu philosophy, samsara is the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, broken only by enlightenment. In Norse tales, history itself is cyclical, worlds destroyed and reborn in endless repetition. Across cultures, the wheel is both punishment and warning. Resist transformation, and eternity becomes repetition. The signs of the eternal wheel are everywhere. The addict who circles relapse after relapse, swearing each time it is the last. The family that repeats generations of violence and silence. The nation that cycles through corruption and collapse, blind to its own history. Each is a wheel turning, grinding souls into dust. The stages of this curse are merciless. First, ignorance. The soul does not see the pattern. Second, recognition. The soul glimpses repetition, but denies responsibility. Third, resignation. The soul accepts the cycle as destiny. Fourth, identification. The soul embraces the wheel as identity, repeating proudly. Fifth, dissolution. The soul dies within the circle, never having escaped, its life indistinguishable from the shadow that ruled it. Jung wrote that what you resist not only persists, but grows. On the wheel, what is resisted becomes eternal. When magnified to civilizations, the wheel of stagnation becomes history. Empires rise and fall in predictable arcs. Revolutions devour themselves. Religions fossilize. Economies collapse. Humanity claims progress, repeats wars, tyrannies, injustices with uncanny precision. Jung warned that until the collective confronts its shadow, history will not move forward but circle endlessly, an eternal return of violence and decay. The protocol of survival is awakening. To break the wheel, one must choose consciousness, must confront the shadow, and embrace transformation no matter the cost. This is not safety, it is death and rebirth. Jung called it individuation, the process by which the self steps off the circle and into wholeness. Few dare to take this path because it demands surrender of comfort, of identity, of illusion. But those who do escape the wheel discover true life, movement, growth, destiny beyond repetition. Yet the tragedy is unavoidable. Most will never escape. Most will live and die within their circles, polishing the same wounds, repeating the same rituals, teaching the same prisons to their children. Their wheel turns silently, grinding eternity into dust. Remember this, the secret of stagnation is not laziness or weakness. It is possession by the shadow, addiction to repetition, war against time itself. It is the wheel that turns until death, unless you dare to break it. And if you do not, if you remain blind, passive, afraid, then your life will not be a story. It will be a circle, endless, merciless, forgotten. For the soul that refuses transformation does not live, it spins.